As more and more Americans shift to the West after the Civil War, we're going to see conflict between people that are already there. So let's talk first about conflict with other white settlers, and then we'll move on to talk about conflict with Native Americans. Mormons, or people belonging to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, had migrated into Utah in the 1840s when it was still technically part of Mexico. Although they were there for a whole year before the Mexican, year or two before the Mexican American War ended up transferring that territory to the United States. Mormons had migrated to Utah in the 1840s to escape religious persecution. The church had started in what is now upstate New York and had gradually been moving westward as they were trying to find a place to freely practice their religion, where they would not be persecuted for what were seen as relatively unusual beliefs in the context of Protestant Christianity, things like the practice of polygamy or a man being able to have multiple wives was kind of frowned upon by the majority of American Christians at this time. And Mormons had established a large settlement dating back to the 1840s around what is today Salt Lake City. After Utah becomes part of United States territory, the federal government is increasingly uncomfortable with the amount of both religious and secular power wielded by the head of the Mormon Church, at this time, Brigham Young. Because remember, in the United States, we traditionally like to separate church and state. So the idea that the leader of this religious group is also its political leader is a little sticky for the American separation of church and state. So in 1857, the United States government removes Brigham Young from his position as territorial governor of Utah. And that same year, we see a series of attacks on settlers, non-Mormon settlers, moving across Utah to get to places to the west. Most notably, the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1857, which was an attack on a wagon train of non-Mormon settlers, and over 100 men, women, and children were attacked and killed by Mormons. The friction continued as more settlers moved out west and moved through the area of Utah. We also see the expansion of Mormon populations outside of Utah as well. And this friction largely stems from difference, right? Mormons are seen by the vast majority of Americans at this time as kind of weird and strange and different, almost like a cult. And there's very little understanding between different groups, and Mormons at this point in time had experienced enough persecution to be very wary of outsiders coming into what they had established as their religious haven. In an attempt to smooth over conflicts as more and more non-Mormons moved out to the west, we see changes within the Mormon Church. In the 1880s, the Mormon Church officially outlaws polygamy, and in an attempt to kind of address the practice that's most questionable to outsiders of the church. And that does do the trick, seemingly, in terms of getting the federal government more comfortable with Mormons. And when Utah officially appeals for statehood, statehood is granted in 1896. Now, while the Mormons had been there for a couple of decades, much older population in the West is that of Native Americans. In particular, we see a number of tribes across the Great Plains, the biggest ones being groups like the Sioux and the Comanche. And in the Great Plains region, life for these Native American groups who lived in the plains changed when the Spanish, who had arrived in the early 1500s, brought horses with them. So the introduction of the horse, which horses had once existed a very long time ago in North America, but had been extinct for thousands of years. The reintroduction of the horse into the Great Plains region allowed these groups to live a much more mobile lifestyle. Remember, when we talked about farming in the West being challenging due to the conditions of the soil, to access to water, it makes more sense if you're living in this area to live a relatively nomadic or migratory lifestyle. And for most Native American groups living in the Great Plains, one of the biggest things that sustained them was the buffalo, which is a chief source of not only food, but also shelter and clothing and tools, because every part of the buffalo is used. Now, pressures from pre-existing European and American colonization had pushed new groups of Native Americans into these regions in the West that previously did not live there. Think, for example, of Oklahoma Territory, which becomes a place where the United States government parks groups like the Cherokee and the Chickasaw and the Seminole, who traditionally live in the southeastern United States, in movements like the Trail of Tears in the 1830s and 40s. So this leads to increasing competition over land and resources and warfare even before the arrival of white settlers, as we have now rival groups of Native Americans. Early American migrants on trails to the West before the Civil War didn't really stick around the Great Plains region. They were more interested in getting to Oregon or California. So they were just passing through. And as such, they didn't really encounter a whole lot of hostility from Native Americans. It's not really until after the 1850s when these settlers start parking in these areas, and especially after the 1860s with the Homestead Act, to try taking advantage of this land, that we start to see conflict escalate between settlers and Native Americans. After the Civil War, attention turns to the Western region, and the United States Army becomes the chief tool in dealing with Native American populations and the friction between Native Americans and these white settlers. In particular, former Union generals who were stationed out west after the Civil War began using tactics that they had honed in battle against the Confederacy. So things like scorched earth campaigns, designed to terrorize the native population and destroy their economy and food sources. These were things that they'd used against the Confederates in the South. Now they're using these same tactics against Native Americans in the West. And in the Great Plains region, that means going after the buffalo. It's estimated by biologists that about 30 million buffalo probably existed around the year 1800 in the United States. But by 1886, the buffalo was almost completely extinct. So why is it that we have this huge population drop? Part of it is due to overhunting. Again, as more native groups are pushed out to the west, there's more demand on resources, including buffalo. But part of it as well is this, the buffalo is seen as a nuisance to farmers and ranchers who are living out in these western states. And the Army and the U.S. government also put bounties on buffalo. So in other words, they pay you money if you bring in buffalo heads. And they're doing this as a way to deprive Native Americans of this vital resource. So conflict in the West is ratcheting up between the United States government and white settlers and the Native Americans. And with the Army using these tactics of fairly extreme warfare against Native Americans, the goal becomes, okay, well then what next? What happens after you deprive them of resources?